What happens when the man you try to intimidate is the very one who holds your future in his hands? One quiet evening in Sacramento, a simple traffic stop turned into a moment that would shake an entire police department. This isn't just a story about a red light. It's a story about power, arrogance, and the courage to hold authority accountable. Inside his silver sedan, Daniel Cross sat quietly. He was a man who carried himself with dignity. Neatly dressed in a dark suit, his tie loosened just enough to show he had worked hard all day. The soft hum of the engine and a slow song on the radio made the ride home feel peaceful. Daniel was tired, but he was also content. Then, in an instant, that peace shattered. Blue and red lights flashed behind him. A sharp siren cut through the evening air. Daniel sighed softly, his hands tightening on the steering wheel for a moment. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a light. Still, he pulled over calmly to the side of the road. The door of the police cruiser opened. Out stepped Officer Mark Larson. Mid-30s, buzz cut, chest out, walking with the swagger of someone who believed the street belonged to him. His badge glistened on his chest, but his face carried something colder: suspicion. He leaned down toward Daniel's window. His voice was clipped, flat, but heavy with authority. License and registration. Daniel didn't argue. He moved slowly, carefully, reaching into his glove box and handing over his documents. His movements were calm, deliberate. But even in that short exchange, Daniel could feel it. Larson wasn't looking at his license. He was looking at him, searching for a reason to dig deeper. "You didn't stop fully at the light," Larson said. His tone wavered just slightly, as if even he didn't fully believe it. Daniel nodded politely. "I thought I slowed in time, but I understand, officer. That should have been the end. A warning, maybe a small ticket. But it wasn't." The look in Larson's eyes said something else. He had already made up his mind. He leaned closer, questions dripping from his lips. "You're not from around here, are you? Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Daniel's voice stayed steady. "Just going home." But the calmness only unsettled Larson more. He was expecting nerves, excuses, maybe fear. Instead, Daniel's quiet strength irritated him. It felt like a challenge. "Step out of the car," Larson ordered. Daniel paused. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" "I said step out of the car. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The threat hung heavy in the air. Daniel exhaled slowly, opened the door, and stepped out. The evening light caught him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit pressed and polished, his shoes gleaming. Everything about him said professionalism, respect, composure. But none of that mattered to Officer Larson. Hands on the hood. Daniel obeyed without a word. The officer's hands searched him roughly, longer than necessary. This wasn't about safety. It was about power, a show of dominance. "You seem awfully confident," Larson muttered with a smirk. Daniel's reply was soft but sharp. "Respect isn't confidence." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the silence. Larson flinched just slightly, his control slipping. And then it happened. His mask cracked. "People like you," Larson muttered under his breath, before stopping himself. Daniel lifted his head, his voice calm, but heavy with meaning. "People like me?" The officer's face tightened. He realized too late he had said more than he should. Daniel straightened, his eyes fixed on Larson. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but every syllable carried weight. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson scoffed. "I don't care who you are." Daniel moved slowly, deliberately. He reached into his pocket. His hand was calm, steady. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see this." He pulled out a leather wallet, opened it, and revealed a badge that gleamed in the fading sunlight. "My name is Daniel Cross," he said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself at a dinner table. Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. The silence that followed was deafening. Larson's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed him. Fear, shock, realization. The man he had been trying to intimidate was the very man who held his career in his hands. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights," Daniel continued, his voice calm but cutting. "You turned a traffic stop into something much bigger. Not because of law, but because of assumption." Larson swallowed hard. His hand fell away from his belt. The air between them shifted. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice low and firm. "Remember this, Officer Larson. The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." He took his documents back with steady hands, walked to his car, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred softly, but the silence was louder than any sound. Larson stood frozen in the golden light, his confidence stripped away, his future uncertain. As Daniel drove away, his thoughts weren't about victory. They were about truth. This was never just about one officer. It was about a system that allowed arrogance to grow unchecked. And tonight, Daniel had seen it with his own eyes. For Larson, this was a career-defining mistake. For Daniel, it was the spark of something far greater. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. The night was heavy when Daniel finally reached home. His house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo louder than it should. He loosened his tie, dropped his keys on the table, and sank into the leather chair by the window. But his mind wasn't resting. The face of Officer Larson replayed over and over in his head. The smirk, the arrogance, the sudden fear when the truth was revealed. Daniel wasn't angry. No, anger had burned out of him years ago. What he felt now was something different. A deep sadness, because he knew Larson wasn't the problem. He was just a symptom. Daniel had seen it too many times before. Men with badges who forgot the weight of responsibility. Men who thought power was meant to intimidate, not protect. Men who wore arrogance like armor. And the truth hurt. This wasn't about one officer. It was about a culture, a system. The next morning, Daniel walked into the Internal Affairs building with the same calm stride he always carried. His colleagues greeted him politely. "Good morning, Chief." But he barely heard them. His mind was locked on the events of last night. He stepped into his office. The walls were lined with case files, each one a story of misconduct, abuse, or corruption. He had read too many of them. Too many officers who thought they were untouchable. Daniel sat at his desk, opened a fresh file, and began to write. Not about Larson. Not yet. This was something bigger. He was drafting a report on patterns he had seen for years. Unchecked authority, lack of accountability, and the dangerous gap between the community and the people sworn to protect it. His pen moved slowly, each word deliberate. The greatest threat to justice is not the criminal who breaks the law, but the officer who twists it for his own power. He paused, staring at the sentence. It wasn't just paper. It was truth. Later that day, a younger officer knocked on his door. Officer Maya Ruiz, new to the department, full of energy but still learning the ropes. "Sir," she said, stepping in carefully, "we got another complaint." Same officer. Lawson. Daniel's eyes didn't move, but his jaw tightened. "What happened?" She flipped open the file. Excessive force during a routine stop. Civilian says he was shoved and threatened for asking a simple question. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. It was confirmation of what he already knew. Larson wasn't acting out of the blue. He was a pattern, a repeat offender. Maya looked at him, unsure. "Do you want me to file this under minor conduct?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, file it under investigation." Directly. Her brows lifted. That wasn't normal. Usually, smaller complaints were buried, softened, or delayed. But Daniel had no intention of letting this one slide. When she left, Daniel leaned back in his chair. He knew what he was walking into. Officers like Larson didn't rise out of nowhere. They were protected, shielded, encouraged by silence. And silence, Daniel thought, was the most dangerous accomplice of all. That evening, Daniel attended a small community meeting in a church basement. Folding chairs filled the room, the smell of old wood and coffee in the air. Local families sat in a circle, some speaking in tired voices, others just listening. A middle-aged man stood up, voice trembling. "I tell my son to keep his hands on the steering wheel, to not move too fast, to not speak unless spoken to. Why should a child grow up fearing the people meant to protect him?" Daniel listened in silence, his heart heavy. Another woman, her hands clasped tight, said softly, "We're not asking for favors. We're asking for fairness." The word struck him. Fairness. Such a simple request, yet so far from reality for many. When the meeting ended, people left slowly, still talking in hushed voices. Daniel remained behind, staring at the empty chairs. He knew the truth. This wasn't just about disciplining one man. It was about confronting a broken system that produced men like Larson and then protected them. And for Daniel, the question was no longer if he would act. It was how far he was willing to go. That night, as he drove home under the dark sky, he whispered to himself, "This is bigger than one man. And if I don't face it, who will?" The battle line had been drawn. But Daniel didn't yet know that exposing the truth would put him in more danger than any street criminal ever could. The next morning, Daniel walked into headquarters with a sense of clarity. He wasn't just carrying his badge. He was carrying the weight of everything he had heard. The father's trembling voice, the mother's plea for fairness, the truth that silence was no longer an option. He knew what had to be done. Daniel opened Larson's file again. The stack of complaints was no longer thin. It had grown heavy, a record of arrogance left unchecked. He didn't hesitate. He signed the order that would escalate Larson's case to a full internal review. For most men, this was paperwork. For Daniel, it was war. That afternoon, Daniel was summoned to the chief's office. Chief Daniels, silver-haired and weary from years in the force, sat behind a large desk. He looked at Daniel with tired eyes. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" the chief said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. You're going to make enemies. Some of these men, they won't forget this." Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Chief, justice doesn't belong to convenience. If we let this go, then we're saying the uniform is more important than the people it serves. That's not justice. That's corruption." The chief sighed, rubbing his temples. "You'll ruffle feathers." "Good," Daniel said. "It's time someone did." Word spread quickly through the department. Whispers in the hallways. Sideways glances. Some officers avoided him. Others looked at him with quiet respect. But one thing was clear. Daniel was no longer just the head of internal affairs. He was a man standing against the tide. And tides always push back. One evening, as Daniel was leaving his office, he found his car door scratched with a sharp blade. A single word was etched deep into the paint. Rat. He stood there in the dark parking lot, staring at it. No fear. No anger. Only confirmation. He was touching nerves. He was breaking the silence. The review board was assembled. Officers, attorneys, and community representatives sat in a long room. Papers spread across the table. At the center sat Officer Larson, no longer smug, no longer swaggering. His uniform looked too big for him now, as if the badge itself weighed him down. Daniel walked in, file in hand. His steps were steady, his presence commanding silence. He spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "This is not about humiliation. This is not about revenge. This is about accountability. An officer who believes he can intimidate civilians without consequence is not protecting the public. He is betraying it. Larson shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. But Daniel didn't flinch. He laid out the complaints one by one. The patterns, the testimonies, the truth. And when he was done, he looked around the room, his voice low but sharp. If we excuse this, we excuse every injustice that follows. A badge does not shield a man from responsibility. It magnifies it. Silence filled the room. No one could deny the truth. The board delivered its decision. Larson would be suspended, pending further disciplinary action. But Daniel knew this wasn't the true victory. The real battle was cultural, a system that had to change, not just a man who had to fall. Weeks later, Daniel stood on a stage at a public forum. The hall was packed with officers, city officials, and ordinary citizens. The air was thick with expectation. Daniel adjusted the microphone, his voice steady but full of weight. Justice isn't only about catching criminals, he said. It's about making sure the ones we trust to enforce the law do so with fairness. A badge isn't a weapon. It isn't power. It's trust. And trust must be earned again and again, every single day. The room erupted in applause. Some officers clapped reluctantly, others with pride. But everyone heard him. Daniel didn't smile. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for change. That night, as he drove home under the same Sacramento sky where everything had begun, he thought of the traffic stop that had sparked it all. A single red light, a siren, a moment of arrogance. And yet, from that moment, something larger had been born. Daniel whispered to himself, almost like a vow, "This is only the beginning." And deep inside, he knew the fight for accountability would never be easy, never be popular, but it was worth it. Because silence helps no one. And justice, real justice, demanded a voice. Before you go, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you watching this from? Type your country or city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has reached.